Chapter 9. I Come of Age. I now come to a time of my life of which I am bitterly ashamed. I forgot my old friends Joe and Biddy. I did not visit them at the forge. I spent too much money and got into debt. I thought only of the time when I would be 21, the time when I would receive my fortune and be able to marry Estella. One day, I received a message from Estella. It was a short note, but it made me very happy. Satis House. I am coming to London in 2 days' time. Miss Havisham wants you to meet me at the coach office in Cheapside. The coach arrives at 5 o'clock. Yours, Estella. I met Estella at the coach office and then took her to Richmond. She was more beautiful than ever. Estella was going to live in the house of an important lady. She was going to be introduced to the rich and powerful people of London society. Now that Estella was living in London, I tried to see her as often as I could. I would often go to Richmond and wait for many hours outside her house, hoping to see her. Sometimes Estella allowed me to see her, and once she let me kiss her. But she was often as proud and cold as she had been in the old days. At this time, I started to get more and more into debt. Living in London cost a lot of money. I bought fashionable clothes and expensive food and drink. Herbert and I joined a club for young gentlemen, and we went to the theatre, the opera, and well-known restaurants. But the allowance I received was not enough to pay all of my debts. And Herbert was poor, and he did not have the expectation of a fortune. He could not pay his debts. On my 21st birthday, I would come of age. I would become a rich man of property. On that day, I would receive my fortune. I waited anxiously for that day. I had not seen Biddy and Joe for many months. Then one day a letter arrived from Biddy with bad news. My sister, Mrs. Joe, was dead. I went by coach from London to the funeral in the country. My sister was buried near my parents, in that lonely churchyard near the marshes. As I stood in the graveyard beside Biddy and Joe, I thought of the convict I had met there long ago. In my mind, I saw his face and heard his terrible voice. I remembered how he had frightened me. Now that Mrs. Joe was dead, Biddy was going back to the village. She was going to teach in the school. After supper, I walked with Biddy in the garden. Biddy told me in her quiet way how much Joe loved me and how good he was. I know that, Biddy, I said quickly. I won't forget Joe now he's alone. I shall come here to see him often. Biddy said nothing. Didn't you hear what I said, Biddy? I asked. Yes, Mr. Pip. Don't call me Mr. Pip, Biddy, I said crossly. And why don't you answer my question? Are you quite sure that you will want to come from London to see Joe? Biddy said at last, looking at me carefully. What a terrible thing to say, Biddy, I cried. You have shocked me very much. She did not answer. I slept badly that night, for Biddy's words had upset me. When I got up in the morning, Joe was already at work in the forge. I went in and shook him by the hand. Goodbye, dear Joe. I shall be back soon and often, I said. Never too soon, sir, and never too often, Pip, old chap, Joe replied. I shook hands with Biddy too, although I was still a little angry with her. But Biddy was quite right, of course. In London, my thoughts were only of Estella and my great expectations. I did not go back to see Joe as I had promised. And then, at last, it was my 21st birthday. Mr. Jaggers called me to his office. I first shook hands with Wemmick and then went in to Mr. Jaggers. "Congratulations, Mr. Pip," the lawyer said.
I expect you have some questions to ask me. I shall answer them if I can."
I took a deep breath and began to speak. "Am I going to learn the name of my benefactor today, Mr. Jaggers?"
"No. Ask me another."
"Will I know the name soon?"
"I can't answer that at the moment," Mr. Jaggers said. "Have you another question?"
"Have I anything to receive, sir?" Mr. Jaggers smiled and asked me a question.
"You are in debt, I suppose?"
I said nothing.
"Come, Pip. Are you in debt or not?"
"I'm afraid I am, Mr. Jaggers."
"Of course. You know you are," he said. "Wemmick," he called, "give Mr. Pip that piece of paper. Now, take it in your hand and look at it, Pip."
"This is a banknote for £500, I said in surprise.
"Right, and that sum of money is yours, Pip. It is a small part of your expectations. You will have that sum of money each year. You will not get into debt. Later, you will learn the name of your benefactor. These are my instructions."
I thought for a moment. Is it possible that my benefactor may come to London, or ask me to go anywhere else?
"It is possible, but not yet," Mr. Jaggers said. "That is all I have to say at present, Pip."
As I left Mr. Jaggers' office, I was already making plans. First of all, I must pay all my debts. Secondly, I wanted to help Herbert. Herbert worked hard, but he had no money and no expectations. I knew that Herbert would not accept money from me. So, with Wemmick's help, I made arrangements for him to become a partner in a small business in London. He would work hard and soon be able to marry Clara. My expectations would help them both. Soon after my birthday, I received a short note from Estella. "It is time for me to visit Miss Havisham. She tells me you must take me to Satis House. The day after tomorrow, if you please. Estella." Everything at Satis House was the same. We sat together by the fire in the big room. Miss Havisham looked at Estella, proud of her beauty. Estella told Miss Havisham about all her admirers. Miss Havisham asked many questions and listened to Estella's answers with a cruel smile. As Estella was speaking, Miss Havisham held her arm tightly. But after a time, Estella moved away impatiently.
"Are you tired of me, you ungrateful girl?" Miss Havisham cried. "Do you have a heart of stone?"
"I am what you have made me," Estella answered, with a proud, hard look. "You have looked after me. I owe you everything. What do you want from me now?"
"Love,"
Miss Havisham answered sadly. Estella laughed. "You adopted me. You became my mother," Estella said. "All that I am, all that I have, is yours. But I cannot give you what you never gave me, love."
"I gave her love, didn't I?"
Miss Havisham cried, looking at me.
"I gave her all the love I had. Strong, burning love. You know I'm telling the truth."
"Your love was not true love," Estella answered coldly. "Your plan has always been clear. You wanted revenge for the love you lost. I have learnt your lessons well. I have always followed your teaching."
"So proud, so hard,"
Miss Havisham said, crying softly. "Who taught me to be proud? Who praised me when I was hard?" Estella replied.
"But not proud and hard to me? You cannot be proud and hard to me, Estella,"
Miss Havisham cried, holding out her arms to the beautiful girl. Estella looked at Miss Havisham coldly. "I have never forgotten the wrong done to you. I have behaved as you wanted me to behave," Estella said. "I am what you have made me. That is all." Miss Havisham sank down on the floor, crying bitterly. Her long white hair spread out around her.
"But I wanted you to love me! Love me!" she cried.
Estella, tall and straight, stared at the fire. After a time, we helped Miss Havisham to her feet. When I left, the two women were sitting side by side, silent in that terrible, decaying room. In London, Estella had many admirers. Everywhere Estella went, to the theatre, to balls, to dinners, men fell in love with her. To my horror, Bentley Drummle was one of Estella's admirers. He was very rich, and I thought that Estella made him believe that she liked him. One night, at a ball, Drummle had been paying more attention to Estella than usual. "Why do you let him near you, Estella?" I asked. "Drummle is stupid and bad-tempered. All he has is money and his important family name. But you give him looks and smiles that you never give to me." Estella answered angrily. "Do you want me to treat you like the others?" she asked. "Do you want me to deceive and entrap you?" "Do you deceive and entrap Drummle, then, Estella?" "Yes, him and many others. All of them but you, Pip. Will you never be warned?" "About what?" "Don't fall in love with me. It will bring you nothing but sorrow." Chapter 10. Abel Magwitch. 2 years passed, and I was 23 years old. I was still living with Herbert, but we now had rooms near the river. Herbert's business was doing very well. His company now had offices overseas, and Herbert often went away on business. The weather had been stormy all day. The strong wind was blowing the rain hard against the windows. Herbert was in France on business, and I was alone. A church bell struck 11. I closed the book I was reading. It was time to go to bed. But as I stood up, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. For a moment I felt afraid. Then I picked up the lamp and opened the door. "Who's there? Who do you want?" I called.
"Mr. Pip. Top floor,"
a rough-sounding voice answered. "That is my name," I said. "Is anything wrong?"
"Nothing's wrong,"
the voice replied. I held the lamp higher. A man was coming slowly up the stairs. He was about 60 years old. The man had long grey hair that lay over his shoulders. His face was wrinkled and brown, and he was roughly dressed. To my surprise, the man was holding out his arms to greet me. "Do you wish to come in? Have you business with me?" I asked.
"Yes, I wish to come in, master," the man answered quietly.
He walked slowly into the room. He looked around him with pleasure. "What do you want?" I asked. The man took off his hat and sat down.
"Just give me a little time," he said in his rough voice. "I've come a long way and had a hard journey. You are alone here, aren't you?" he added.
"Why do you, a stranger, ask me that question?"
"A stranger?" the man repeated. "It's a disappointing word to hear when I've come so far. But you're a brave fellow, I can see that. Don't harm me, Pip. You'll be sorry if you do."
And then I knew him. I fell back against the wall. He was the convict I had helped so long ago on the marshes. The man stood up and again held out his arms to me.
Yes, young sir, I am the convict you helped. You were brave then, my boy, he said. I have never forgotten it, Pip. Never.
Stop! I cried, as he moved towards me. That was a long time ago. I was a little child then. I'm pleased you're grateful, and I hope you have changed your way of life. But you must understand. The man looked at me sharply.
Understand? What must I understand? He said.
Understand that our lives are different now, I went on. There is no further reason for us to meet. But you are wet and you look tired. Let me get you a drink before you go. The man sat down again.
I will have a drink before I go, he said slowly. Hot rum and water, if you please.
I prepared the drink quickly. When I handed him the glass, I saw that the old convict's eyes were full of tears. I sat down near him with my own glass. I do not wish to be hard on you, I said. Indeed, I wish you well. How have you been living?
I've been in Australia. I've been a sheep farmer. And I've done well. Marvellously well, the old convict replied.
I'm glad to hear it, I said.
Thank you, dear boy. And I see that you have done well since I last saw you. May I ask, how?
I've come into some property, I said.
May I ask, what property? May I ask, whose?
For some reason, I began to shake with fear. I don't know, I answered.
Could I guess your yearly income since you came of age? The man asked quietly. Would it be £500?
My heart was beating wildly now. I stood up and held tightly to the back of my chair. I stared at the man in terror.
I suppose you had a guardian? A lawyer, maybe, the convict went on. Did his name begin with J?
I could not speak. I felt faint, and the room began to move around me.
Do you want to know how I found you? The convict went on. Well, that lawyer has a clerk called Wemmick. He sent me your address.
I could not breathe. I gave a cry and almost fell to the ground. The old convict caught hold of me and placed me gently on a chair.
Yes, Pip, dear boy, he said. It's me what's made a gentleman of you. I swore that I would make you a gentleman, and I have. Every guinea I've made has been for you. I've lived a poor life, so that you could live well. Yes, Pip, that starving convict you met on the marshes has made you a gentleman. I've sent money all these years for you to spend. And now I've come to see the gentleman I've made. Look at your clothes, he went on. A gentleman's clothes. And these are your books, he added, looking around the room. Hundreds and hundreds of books. You shall read them to me, dear boy, for I've had no education. But it's me what's had you educated. I'm proud of you, Pip, dear boy, proud.
And he took my cold hands and put them to his lips. I felt very ill. I could not speak.
Don't try to talk, Pip, the old convict went on. You weren't prepared for this, I see. Didn't you ever think it could be me?
Never. No, never, I whispered.
Well, it was me, and no one knew about it but Mr. Jaggers.
The old man smiled.
How good-looking you've grown, my boy, he said. You're in love with a beautiful girl, I'm sure. She shall be yours, if money can help you.
Estella. Oh, Estella, I thought.
Yes, You've grown to be a fine gentleman, Pip, the convict said. I promised myself I would see you one day, and now I have. It wasn't safe to come, but I came.
Not safe? What do you mean? I asked in surprise.
I was transported for life, he answered quietly. If you're sent as a convict to Australia, it's death to return. If I'm caught, I shall be hanged. Hanged by the neck until I'm dead.
I held my head in my hands. This wretched man was my benefactor. By coming to see me, he had ruined all my dreams. And he had put his own life in danger too. I could not send him away. I stood up slowly. I closed the shutters over the windows and locked the door. I prepared the bed in Herbert's room for the man, and at last he went to sleep. Later, I sat by the fire trying to think. Miss Havisham's plans for me. All a dream. Estella. She was not meant for me. And because of this man, a convict, I had forgotten Joe and Biddy. I could never undo the wrong I had done them. What should I do with the man in the next room? What was going to become of him? What was going to become of me? At last, I fell asleep by the fire. I awoke to hear the church bell striking 5. The room was dark. The wind was still blowing the rain hard against the windows. I made breakfast. The old convict ate in great mouthfuls. I was disgusted by him. He then lit his pipe and stood in front of the fire. He took out a wallet of money and threw it onto the table. "There, my boy, spend that," he said. "I've come back to see my boy spend money like a gentleman." No, we must talk," I cried. "I don't even know your name. How long are you staying in England? Where do you plan to live?" "My name is Magwitch, Abel Magwitch," he said. "And I'm staying in England forever, though it's death by hanging if I'm caught." I decided that I had to speak to Mr. Jaggers. Leaving Magwitch alone, I locked the door of my rooms and hurried to the lawyer's office. When he saw me, Mr. Jaggers held up his hand. "Don't tell me anything. I don't want to know," he said quickly. "I must know one thing, Mr. Jaggers," I said. "I have been told something about my benefactor. Is it true?" "You cannot have been told anything. Told means you have talked to that person. You cannot have talked to him. He is in Australia. You must have been informed," Mr. Jaggers warned me. I understood then that Mr. Jaggers knew Abel Magwitch was in England, and he knew that his client was in danger. "Informed, then," I agreed. "Informed that Abel Magwitch is my benefactor." "That is true. Your benefactor is the man in Australia." "But I thought that Miss Havisham—" I began. "You have misunderstood. Miss Havisham was never your benefactor. Your benefactor is far away, but he has plenty of money for you. You will have it soon." I did not want the money now. I knew that Estella would never be mine. I left Mr. Jaggers' office without another word. On my way home, I bought some new clothes for Abel Magwitch. But when I had cut his hair and he was dressed in the new clothes, he still looked like a convict. A murderer, perhaps. The more I saw the man, the more I feared and hated him. Herbert returned from France that afternoon. When I heard his step on the stairs, I opened the door quickly. "Hello, Pip," Herbert said cheerfully. Then he added, "How pale you look. What's the matter?" Then he saw Magwitch. "Who is this?" he asked in surprise. "Herbert, my dear friend," I said, shutting and locking the door behind him, "something very strange has happened." Before I could explain, Magwitch took a little black Bible from his pocket and held it out to Herbert.
"Take the holy book in your right hand, dear boy," he said to him. "Swear to God that you will never repeat what Pip is going to tell you."
"Do it, Herbert," I whispered. So Herbert took the Bible and repeated the words, and then the old convict shook him by the hand.
"Now you have sworn on the Bible. God has heard your promise. Sit down and listen to what Pip is going to tell you."
So I told Herbert everything. "I need your help, Herbert," I said at last. "What should I do now?" "My poor dear Pip," Herbert exclaimed. "I am so confused that I cannot think clearly. But the first thing is to find rooms for Mr. Magwitch. Then I'm afraid there is only one thing to do." Herbert turned to Abel Magwitch, who was listening carefully. "You must leave England," Herbert told him. "Go to France or Germany. You will be safe there. And you must go with him, Pip," Herbert went on. "This man's life is in danger because he came to see you. It is only right that you should get him out of danger." I stared at the floor unhappily. I did not care where I went. I had no expectations now, for I could never take money from Magwitch again. My life had been ruined by this man who I hated and feared. "Very well," I said at last. I turned to Magwitch. "If I am to help you, I must know everything about you. Why were you put in prison? Who was that other man on the marshes? Tell us." He stared at the fire for a moment, and then began to speak.
"Dear boy and Pip's friend, my story can be told in a very few words," the convict began. "I don't know where I was born. I know nothing about myself but my name. The first thing I remember was stealing food to keep alive. In jail and out of jail, in jail and out. I was punished wherever I went. I had no education. I only learnt to read and write a little."
Magwitch stopped for a moment, and then went on.
"About 20 years ago I met Compeyson, the man I fought on the marshes. He looked like a gentleman, but he was very wicked and very clever. He asked me to help him with his plans, and he made sure that if anything went wrong, I would be blamed for it. Compeyson had a friend, a young man with a rich sister. The two men treated this woman very badly and stole her money."
When Herbert heard this, he looked up quickly, but he said nothing.
"Later, the young man died," Magwitch went on. "Compeyson had more and more power over me. All the wicked things he planned were done by me. When we were caught, I was blamed for everything. I sold everything I had to pay the lawyer, Mr. Jaggers, to speak for me in court. But when Compeyson and me stood up in court, he was dressed like an honest gentleman, and I looked wicked and dishonest. So he was sent to prison for 7 years. I was sent to prison for 14 years, and we were both sent to the hulks. One day, I had a fight with Compeyson and cut his face. I escaped from the hulks onto the marshes. That's where you helped me, dear boy. When I found out that Compeyson had escaped too, I caught him and waited for the soldiers to come. So, instead of escaping, I was transported to Australia for life."
"And Compeyson?" I asked quietly. "Where is he now?"
"I never heard of him again. He may be alive or dead, I don't know. But if he finds me here, it's death for me, or him."
The old convict said no more, but smoked his pipe and stared at the fire. Herbert passed a piece of paper to me. On it, he had written these words: "Miss Havisham's brother was the young man." Compeyson was the man who was going to marry her. But he stole her money and left her on her wedding day. I looked at Herbert, but said nothing. I was trying to think. If Compeyson was alive, he might find out that Magwitch had returned. Herbert was right. Magwitch was in danger in London. I had to take the old man away as soon as possible. That same day, we found a cheap room for him to stay in. Some days later, Herbert took Magwitch to the house where Clara lived with her father. The house was at Old Millbank, a quiet place near the river. Magwitch could live there on the top floor. As soon as possible, we would get him out of England. We told Wemmick of our plan. He promised to warn us if anyone asked about Magwitch. Every time I went out, I thought that someone was following me. Was Compeyson alive and in London? Had he seen his old enemy? Did Compeyson know about me and Abel Magwitch? Chapter 11. Secrets from the Past. My expectations were at an end. Miss Havisham was not my benefactor. Estella could not be mine. But I had to see her again. I found out that Estella was staying with Miss Havisham, and I decided to go to Sattie's house for the last time. Once more, I walked through the dark, dusty corridors of Sattie's house. I found Miss Havisham and Estella sitting together in the dressing room. Estella was knitting. Both women looked at me in surprise.
"Why are you here, Pip?"
Miss Havisham asked. "I have something that I must say to you, Miss Havisham," I replied. "I have found out who my benefactor is, and I am very unhappy. I thought it was you. You knew that I thought this, but you did not tell me my mistake. Was that kind, Miss Havisham?"
"Kind? Do you expect me to be kind, Pip?"
Miss Havisham answered, hitting her stick on the floor angrily. "I expect nothing from you, Miss Havisham," I said quietly. "I have come because I need your help, but not for myself."
"Who do you want me to help?" Miss Havisham asked. "What do you want, Pip?"
2 years ago, I was able to help my good friend Herbert Pocket. I paid money for him to become a partner in a business, I explained. He does not know who did this. Now I need more money to complete my plans for him. I cannot take money from my benefactor. Can you help me? At first, Miss Havisham said nothing. Then she spoke.
"Have you anything else to say, Pip?"
she asked. I looked at Estella. She went on knitting and did not raise her head. "Estella," I said, "you know I love you. I have always thought that Miss Havisham wanted us to marry. I know now that this is not true, but I must tell you that I love you and always will." "Love is a word I do not understand," Estella answered. "I tried to warn you, Pip, but you didn't listen. I am going to be married, but not to you." "Then who?" I began. "Bentley Drummle," Estella said quietly. "Estella, that can't be true," I cried. "He is stupid and cruel. You will never be happy with him." "Do you think he will be happy with me?" Estella said, with a cold smile. "I know nothing of happiness or love. You will soon forget me, Pip." "You are part of my life, part of every breath I take," I whispered. "I shall never forget you, Estella. Never. God bless you and forgive you." I kissed her hand. I do not remember leaving the room. I was in despair. Without waiting for the coach, I set off to walk the long road to London. It was after midnight when I reached home. I climbed the stairs to our rooms, desperate and exhausted. Fixed to the door was a piece of paper.
"Don't stay here tonight. Go to Old Millbank at 8 tomorrow night. Burn this note."
The message was in Wemmick's writing. I stayed at an inn and waited for the hours to pass. At 8 o'clock that night, I was outside the house at Old Millbank. I knocked at the door and Herbert opened it. He took me inside and spoke quietly. "He is safe now," Herbert said, "but there is danger. Wemmick found out and warned us. Come upstairs and see Magwitch." Abel Magwitch was sitting quietly by the window of his room. He was looking at the river below him. His face looked old and gentle now.
"I'm pleased to see you, dear boy," he said. "Compeyson is in London, looking for me. Compeyson found out that I had come to see you. But Herbert thinks I'm safe here, and Jaggers knows everything."
"This is a good place to be for another reason," Herbert told me. "When you and Magwitch are ready to leave, we can row him down the river ourselves. You can get on board a ship at the mouth of the river. Compeyson would not expect you to escape like this. You will soon be far away." "When do we go?" I asked quickly. "Soon, Pip," Herbert said. "First, we'll buy a boat and row up and down the river every day. People will get used to seeing us. They will think we enjoy rowing on the river. Meanwhile, I will come here as usual. When I visit Clara, I can see Magwitch. You must not come here, Pip. Compeyson wants you to lead him to Magwitch." We followed Herbert's plan. Herbert and I rowed on the river nearly every day. No stranger went near Old Millbank, but I was unhappy. I spent many hours walking the streets alone. One evening, I met Mr. Jaggers.
"Come and dine with me, Pip," the lawyer said. "I have something for you."
When we were sitting in Mr. Jaggers' house, he gave me a note from Miss Havisham. She wanted to see me on business. I decided to go to Saty's house the next day.
"Well, Pip," Mr. Jaggers said as we sat down to eat, "I hear that Estella is married. She is Mrs. Bentley Drummle now. There will be only one master in that marriage, Mrs. Bentley Drummle."
As Mr. Jaggers was speaking, Molly, his housekeeper, placed our food on the table. As she stood behind her master, Molly moved her hands nervously. She moved her hands as though she was knitting. I looked at the woman's dark eyes, her long dark hair and her moving fingers. Where had I seen hair and movements like that before? I remembered the last time I had seen Estella, and a strange idea came into my mind. I grew pale, and my heart began to beat very fast. I did not speak, but Mr. Jaggers saw me looking at Molly. When Molly left the room, he slowly nodded his head. I had not asked the question, but he had answered it. It was true. Molly was Estella's mother, and only Mr. Jaggers and I knew the truth. The next day, I went to Saty's house. Miss Havisham was in the big room with the long table. She was sitting in a chair by the fire. She agreed to help Herbert. When we had finished our business, she looked at me sadly. "Are you very unhappy, Pip?" she asked. "Yes, Miss Havisham, I am. There are many things making me unhappy. You know about one of them." Suddenly, Miss Havisham fell down on her knees. "Oh, what have I done? What have I done?" she cried. "Estella is married. Do you know that?" "Yes." "Then forgive me, Pip. Forgive me for making you unhappy." "I forgive you, Miss Havisham," I answered. I am to blame for my unhappiness too. But Estella is also unhappy. You should ask her for forgiveness. You have made her what she is."
Yes, I know it," Miss Havisham cried. "I adopted her when she was a little child. I was unhappy and wanted revenge. I took away love from her heart and put ice in its place. If you knew my story, you would understand."
"Miss Havisham, I do know your story," I answered. "I know why you adopted Estella and taught her to be cruel. I do not hate you, Miss Havisham. I am sorry for you." I helped Miss Havisham back into her chair by the fire. Then I left the room quietly. I went downstairs and walked up and down in the garden. A feeling of great sadness filled my heart as I stood in that unhappy place. I knew I would never return to Setter's house. I ran upstairs quickly to see Miss Havisham for the last time. She was sitting quietly by the fire and did not move. As I turned to go, a great flame sprang up suddenly from the fire. The flame leapt onto Miss Havisham's old torn clothes. As I stood there, she ran towards me, crying out in terror. Her torn clothes were burning fiercely. I pulled off my heavy coat and threw it over the screaming woman, pushing her down. Then I dragged the cloth from the table to cover her. The remains of the ruined wedding feast crashed down. There were clouds of dust, and mice and spiders ran across the floor. Miss Havisham screamed and screamed with pain. Hearing Miss Havisham's cries, the servants rushed in. We laid Miss Havisham on the table and covered her gently. She was badly burned and could not be moved. Over and over again, she repeated the same words. "What have I done? What have I done? Forgive me! Oh, forgive me!" A servant went to fetch a doctor, but he could not help her. Miss Havisham lay there for several hours. I stayed with her until, calm at last, she died. My hands and arms had been badly burned. Herbert came to Satis house, and he took me back to London. There he looked after me. He was kind and gentle. At first, my mind was confused, but with Herbert's help, I slowly grew stronger. My first thoughts were for Magwitch. "He is safe," Herbert told me, "but as soon as you are well, we must help him to escape." "I like him better now," Herbert went on. "We have talked together many times. Did you know he once had a wife, Pip? Magwitch's wife was a wild young woman and very jealous. She thought another woman wanted to steal her husband, so she fought the woman, and the woman died. Magwitch's wife was put on trial for murder." "Murder?" I repeated in horror. "Yes, murder. She was put on trial, but Mr. Jaggers was her lawyer. He spoke for her in court, and she was acquitted. Magwitch and this woman had a child, a little girl," Herbert went on. "Magwitch loved the child very much, but after the trial the woman and the child disappeared. Magwitch never saw them again." "Herbert," I said slowly, "how long ago did these things happen?" "About 20 years ago," Herbert answered. 3 or 4 years before Magwitch saw you in the churchyard. You reminded him of the child he had lost." I sat up slowly. "Herbert," I said, "I have something to tell you. I am sure it is the truth. The man we are hiding, Abel Magwitch, the returned convict, is Estella's father." As soon as I was strong enough, I went to see Mr. Jaggers. "We know who Estella's mother is, Mr. Jaggers," I told him.
"Estella's mother, Pip?"
Mr. Jaggers said carefully. "Yes, I have seen her in your house, Mr. Jaggers." The lawyer said nothing. I now know something more. The name of Estella's father, I went on. Mr. Jaggers looked at me sharply. His name is Abel Magwitch, I said, and Abel Magwitch is the man who is my benefactor.
Why does Magwitch think this?
Mr. Jaggers asked in surprise. He doesn't think this, I answered. He does not know that his daughter is alive. I told Mr. Jaggers everything I knew, and the things I had guessed. Mr. Jaggers, I said at last, terrible things have happened to all these people. They must be told the truth. Mr. Jaggers thought for a time before he spoke.
Perhaps you are right in what you have guessed, Pip. But who would be helped by knowing the truth now? Would the mother be helped? Or the father? Or the child? Think carefully, Pip. No one would be helped by knowing the truth. No one.
Mr. Jaggers was right. I thought of Estella. She had married a rich man from a proud family, but she was the daughter of a convict. The truth would destroy her. She must never know it.